Hi, I'm Bob McCoskrie. Welcome to Family Matters. Today the topic is surrogacy, and Gary Powell is the European Special Consultant to the Centre for Bioethics and Culture. In 2021, he was appointed as Research Fellow at the Bow Group, the oldest conservative think tank in the United Kingdom. He graduated with first-class honours from Oxford University, where his philosophy tutors included the Right Honourable Baroness Mary Warnock, who first inspired his interest in the ethics of third-party reproduction. And Warnock was the chair of the UK Committee of Inquiry into Human Fertilisation and Embryology that led to the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Act in 1990. Gary is an original signatory of the Stop Surrogacy Now statement and argues for a ban on all forms of surrogacy for all people, regardless of sexual orientation, because of the unacceptable risks and harm it involves, including the exploitation and commodification of women and children. And he wrote an excellent article entitled "Whose Rights Are Important Here?", which piqued my interest in the need for us to talk to Gary. Gary, welcome to Family Matters. It's great to have you.
A pleasure. Thank you for inviting me, Bob.
Now, Gary, just tell us a bit about your background and how you got involved in this issue.
Well, as you mentioned in the intro, one of my philosophy tutors at university was Mary Warnock, who was regarded as one of the leading ethical philosophers on embryology and fertilization. And she had a very important impact on the development of law in the UK. I was fortunate enough to have her as one of my philosophy tutors, and we discussed surrogacy during a tutorial once. And that was the beginning of my interest. But then it went somehow on to the back burner over a number of following years. And it then came back into my consciousness again when I was reading some reports on social media as to the kinds of people who were running surrogacy agencies and the kind of ethical decisions that they were empowered to make. And some of the harms that were being caused to women and babies as a result of engagement in the surrogacy process, and of course that the most serious aspect of this, or one of the most serious aspects, was the fact that we'd moved into the territory of commercial surrogacy in a number of countries of the world, a number of states in the USA. I was lucky enough to watch some films by Jennifer Lal, the president of the Centre for Bioethics and Culture, very powerful, impactful films on surrogacy and third-party reproduction. And I was really shocked at what I discovered from those films. I read some more material from the Centre for Bioethics and Culture, got in touch with Jennifer and became associated with her organization. And another aspect of my work is that I'm a gay man, and I've been involved in gay politics since the early 1980s. Now, I'm not your typical gay man in that respect because I'm a conservative activist. And I don't associate myself at all with the LGBT plus movement, which I regard as homophobic, misogynistic, and severely detrimental to child safeguarding. So a lot of my efforts these days are focused on opposing the LGBT plus movement and the serious harm that it's doing to society. And one of the prongs of that serious harm is the drive from the LGBT plus community to legalize surrogacy, to frame surrogacy as a putative gay right, a means by which gay men can have their own biological children. Right. So really, it's heaping toxicity upon toxicity on Western civilization, on Western values. So I spend a certain amount of my time just countering gender ideology, which is extremely harmful, and another portion of my time campaigning against surrogacy, which unfortunately is being increasingly rolled out across the West.
But you oppose surrogacy for all forms of couples, don't you? Not just same-sex couples? It's,
absolutely.
And so why?
Yes.
On what basis?
Well, that's a very important point you make there, Bob, because obviously the LGBT plus constituency don't like there being a gay man who's campaigning against surrogacy. So I get misrepresented and lied about on a regular basis. So they will say, oh, Gary Powell campaigns to stop gay men having children via surrogacy, when in fact I campaign against all kinds of surrogacy. I campaign for all people to be stopped from engaging in the surrogacy process. So it's not an anti-gay thing. I just want the whole thing to be abolished for gay and straight people alike. The reason I oppose it is because I regard it as similar to the sale of living organs. Which is, of course, illegal globally, with the notable exception of one country, Iran, where it's legal. And it's illegal because it's people know intuitively that having a class of people who are selling their organs to another class who can afford to buy them is going to lead to damaging relationships in society. It's intrinsically unethical to have a poor harvesting class who are forced to sell parts of their body because of their destitution to wealthy people who can afford it. Now, people will die as a result of not being able to buy a kidney or a liver lobe. People will die because of that legislation that prohibits it. Nobody will die as a result of not being able to buy a baby via a surrogacy process, or to commission a baby if it's done on an altruistic basis and pay reasonable expenses. No one will die as a result of not having a baby. And yet women are putting their lives at risk and their long-term health at risk when they engage in the process as birth mothers, as surrogate mothers. We all know that pregnancy is a dangerous process, and that childbirth is a particularly dangerous process at the best of times. And all surrogacy births, and there's a new paper published this year by Jennifer Lal and her colleagues demonstrating that that all surrogacy births are high-risk births. All surrogacy pregnancies are high-risk or higher-risk pregnancies. And there's been previous research published that also confirms this. I don't think it's acceptable to treat a woman's body in that way. It's a form of, I call it toxic instrumentalisation. And Kantian philosophy comes to mind when you're enjoined not to treat other people as a means to an end, but instead to treat them as an end in themselves, right. The marker of an ethical action. But in surrogacy, women are being treated as carriers. In fact, they're often called gestational carriers by people promoting surrogacy, rather than women at all, or pregnant mothers, gestational carriers. And this is a form of instrumentalization. We do instrumentalize people, of course. It's a natural thing. We go into a restaurant, somebody brings us our meal, we're instrumentalizing that person to have somebody in the kitchen make the food, bring it over. That's a form of instrumentalization. But I call that's a non-toxic instrumentalization, because you're not putting the person's life or health in danger in any way in that process. And it's a normal part of human behavior to instrumentalize people in that reasonable way. But when it comes to instrumentalizing people, especially for a process that will just bring about a benefit for oneself that isn't life-saving, particularly then I think that is a toxic form of instrumentalization of women's bodies. And it's also dangerous to the children involved. The children are more likely to be born preterm, have a number of health difficulties and psychological problems further on down the line.
Well, let's come back to that. I mean, as I made you aware just in the pre-reading that I sent you, in New Zealand, it is a gay MP in a same-sex relationship who is championing the expansion of our surrogacy laws, which has been considered as we speak. So your viewpoint is certainly coming up against the gay community, because obviously for them, surrogacy is really, well, apart from adoption, surrogacy is the only option that they have in terms of some form of biological connection. So that's probably why there's a lot of resistance to what you're saying. And I mean, it begs the question, are you homophobic? What's the problem with two same-sex parents?
Yeah, well, I mean, that question, am I homophobic? The problem with that word is that it's been redefined as time has gone on. In the 70s, when it was coined by Dr. George Weinberg, the psychologist, it was meant to mean a hatred of homosexuality or a hatred of gay people, which could also be internalized. So a big problem with gay people internalizing homophobia and hating themselves, hating their sexuality, and that was a problem. But we've seen a lot of words getting redefined over the course of recent years, like the word hate, for instance. You don't have to do much these days to be accused of hate. You just have to be somebody who supports civil partnerships but doesn't support gay marriage. Oh, well, then you're homophobic. You hate gay people. Or you might be you have liberal views towards people who identify as transgender, not want them treated badly or differently from anybody else, but not want male-bodied men who identify as trans women going into women's protected spaces. And as a result of that, you get defined as transphobic. But coming back to the homophobia question, I do get accused. I often get accused of homophobia. And it's a bit ironic, given that I've campaigned for gay rights, but sensible gay rights. Not these overreaching so-called rights we hear about these days. Just basic gay rights, reasonable treatment of gay people, parity of esteem. And I've got a pretty good track record on that, but. Today, there really does seem to be an overreach. These organizations that are putatively campaigning for gay rights or LGBT plus rights, I think they will never stop. They will never, ever be satisfied, because these charities and these organizations, they have employees now. They have CEOs. There's a lot of money involved. There's a lot of prestige. And if ever they stop, then that income stream is going to stop. So they're going to have to keep finding new causes to campaign on. And gender ideology is one of them.
Well, one of the interesting things that you say in your paper is your excellent article, which I will encourage people to read. You say there is no such thing as a universal human right to be a parent. But is that true? Because, I mean, that's really what's driving surrogacy, is this belief that we do have a human right to be a parent and we should be able to take all measures possible.
Yes, I mean, that's a common fallacy, that everybody has a human right to be a parent. But the problem is that if you're a parent, there are other people involved in the equation as well. I mean, if you're a male, a gay male, or in a gay male same-sex relationship, you're going to need a woman somehow at some part of that process. Usually it's two women, one woman to sell the egg, they call it egg donation, and the other woman to carry the baby to term. So immediately you've got other people involved in the process whose rights are equally important. And then you've got the baby. So you've got yet another party with human rights. And one of the problems I'm seeing, especially in the LGBT plus movement, is gay men with a very blinkered view thinking, well, yes, I have a right to this, and this right is absolute, and every other right should fall in line with this right that I'm claiming for myself. So that the rights of women to freedom from exploitation, and often it's economically vulnerable women who tend to get involved in surrogacy to pay off debts and to pay bills. The rights of those people not to be coerced into something that they wouldn't otherwise do. That isn't the case in what happens in New Zealand at the moment, but of course, by the way, because New Zealand has only legalized altruistic surrogacy as
yeah, although I mean there is
some
discussion around that about how much payment should be made, and I guess that's a really important question, because I know you talk about big surrogacy, which is exploitation, women being paid to carry babies, but does this mean that altruistic surrogacy can be okay when it's simply done as almost a service, almost a love gift?
Right. Well, that's a really important question, and I would say no, and I would say under no circumstances should that happen, because even if there is no financial compensation happening, normally, I mean, under English law, the 1985 Surrogacy Arrangements Act allows for reasonable expenses to be paid to the birth mother.
Yep.
But that's not. Reasonable expenses aren't defined, and we're seeing sums, between £12,000 and £20,000. That's the official sums being paid to the mothers. And then they have a right to maternity pay and maternity leave. So it turns out to be quite an attractive package. So the danger is that people can be drawn into altruistic surrogacy, or in the UK, I tend to call it so-called altruistic surrogacy, because they want to pay off their debts, pay bills. And that is a form of coercion, in a sense. It's an internal coercion, but it's the same kind of coercion that happens when people sell their organs to cover debts. There's something dehumanizing about it, and exploitative, instrumentalising. And even if nothing was paid at all, if nothing was paid, not even any expenses, we've got a situation where a woman could be endangering her life in this process of carrying a baby to birth. I mean, a certain, a significant percentage of births end up in complications. So the woman could end up suffering some physical detriment. That can turn into PTSD later on. But the whole question is whether a surrogacy pregnancy is something that should be best avoided. I mean, obviously, if the human species is going to continue, people need to keep on having babies. And it's natural to our human situation that will continue, and people will want to keep having families. But in a situation where you're having a baby for other people that they can't have for themselves, people do need to ask themselves whether this is a legitimate risk that they should be undertaking.
Well, one thing that I wondered about, Gary, was that can we, as two blokes, as men, truly understand what it's like for a surrogate to give up a child immediately after birth? I mean, in your paper, you refer to the fact that we don't even do that to puppies, that, the law requires that the puppy has to remain with the mother for, a number of weeks, maybe 2 months or whatever it is. And yet, what is it like for a woman to have to give up something that she has carried for 9 months? Can we even understand what that would be like?
Well, that's a really good question. And when I see a number of men talking about their surrogacy experiences or advocating for surrogacy, I really wonder whether they do have a proper understanding of what that must be like to surrender a baby just after the baby's been born, for the mother who's carried that baby for 9 months. And of course, one of the problems with men is that we tend to be less empathic than women on the whole. And we tend to struggle more to work out what's going on in other people's emotional experience and cognitive experience. And I think that there is a bit of an empathy gap going on with a number of the gay men who are advocating surrogacy without properly investigating the harms that it causes to women in general, the risks that are posed to women.
Now, you use a term, genealogical bewilderment. Could you define that, please?
Yes.
Genealogical bewilderment.
Yeah. Well, genealogical bewilderment is a sense of not being anchored in the world, is a sense of not being existentially or socially anchored in the world, because you don't know who your biological father is or your biological mother. It happens frequently to people who have been adopted and who don't know where they've come from, who their biological parents are. And it can give rise to a greater or lesser extent to feelings of insecurity and low self-esteem. In fact, I mean, for those of us who have come into the world in the standard way, we know who our parents are, we know who our grandparents are or were. We have other siblings. We have a sense of continuity in our genealogical history. But when people come into the world via surrogacy, and of course people have the same experience, sadly, with adoption, there can be this sense of really wanting to know where you've come from, where you fit in the world, what your history is. And I was reading that some children, or quite often when they get a bit older, people go into adulthood, and they want to get in touch with, they want to find out who their birth mother was, not only the birth mother, but who donated the egg, their biological mother, and they want to let them know that they're okay.
Well, we already
there's a
have
need
that with
to communicate.
I mean, that was one of the criticisms of closed adoption, wasn't it? That people weren't able to find their genealogical background. They weren't able to find their birth parents. And it's actually one of the most popular TV programs in New Zealand at the moment, and it's just starting up a new series where the host helps people find their genealogical connections. Very popular. Yes. But look, what about the good stories that we hear about, Gary? I mean, I think every one of us has heard about perhaps someone who has carried a baby for another woman who can't. In fact, we had friends who the sister provided the egg for her sister because she wasn't able to produce one herself. You know, that's kind of it gave life, it gave children to a loving family. How do you counter those stories?
Well, even the happy family stories that we hear about, even the situations where it seems nobody's come to any harm, nobody's been coerced, everybody's been happy, everything seems to have gone very smoothly. Those situations are prizing the door open to further cases of surrogacy. And for all the good news stories we hear about surrogacy, there are going to be others where something has gone seriously wrong and somebody's health has been very badly affected. Somebody might have lost their life. A child might end up suffering psychological consequences. And there's another problem with those kinds of stories, because they end up putting pressure on family members to volunteer to be birth mothers to members of the family who can't carry. And in those family situations, it's very easy for a situation of emotional coercion to come about, or for people to volunteer to do this when they don't really want to do it, but they would feel guilty if they didn't volunteer. So that falls far short of being a fully free and autonomous decision to undertake that surrogacy commitment. And we never know in families just to what degree people are really happy about taking on that commitment. And the other problem is with these situations risk causing serious rifts in families as well. People can fall out. Family members can fall out during the pregnancy. The birth mother might fall out with her brother for whom she's carrying, or sister for whom she's carrying the baby. And those disagreements can make things very difficult. Or the intended parents for whom she's carrying it might be the brother and his girlfriend or wife, or the brother and his boyfriend or husband. If that couple splits up during the pregnancy, and that does happen sometimes, they might not want that baby anymore. They might not know what to do with the baby. And normally in countries where only altruistic surrogacy arrangements prevail, and where commercial surrogacy is legalized, normally people have to adopt the baby after birth. So the birth mother will remain the legal mother of that child. Now, if the intended parents have lost interest, then she could end up with a son or daughter that she wasn't expecting to have. It's a recipe for all kinds of really serious. And then on top of that, there are the health problems and risks that are inherent in surrogacy to the mother and to the baby. So for those reasons, and for the fact that any form of surrogacy is pushing open the floodgates for more liberal forms of surrogacy, including commercial surrogacy. The simplest approach and neatest approach is to say none of it can happen. Surrogacy is illegal.
So the Member of Parliament who is promoting the expansion of surrogacy is a gay man, is in a same-sex relationship. And look, let me just show you a couple of video clips of, it's Tamati Coffey is a Labour MP, and he's put his relationship out in the public media. I guess it's part of the argument for expanding surrogacy. And so let's just watch a couple of clips that he did for the Sunday program.
We've come a long way. Same-sex marriage is legit. There's laws against discrimination, but becoming a parent for a gay male is not easy. For starters, biology is not on their side.
Because between us both, we don't have the bits that it takes.
So Tamati and Tim needed to find an egg to fertilise and a surrogate to carry it.
So which comes first? The chick or the egg? Which one did come first?
The surrogate came first. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Natasha and I'm the surrogate.
There are strict rules. It takes a special person to be a surrogate.
Basically write off a year of their life so that they can carry for you. And that's a huge commitment for anybody.
It's selfless, eh?
It's really selfless.
Yeah. You tie my hair. Where's the hairbrush?
3 children from a sperm donor. Natasha's paying it forward.
Ah, pretty. Yeah.
It's my one-in-a-lifetime thing I'll do. So thank you for my babies.
You sing it.
Baby. So someone gave me a donation and I got 3 children out of it. And it just felt wrong to carry on and not stop and give back.
Perfectly on time.
Surrogacy in New Zealand is DIY. You have to find a surrogate yourself. In this case, these 3 were introduced by a mutual friend.
Yeah, it was like the awkward date.
I was like, okay, so do I take my medical records? Like, what kind of person are they looking for?
Then we start talking about babies and...
I was like, pick me, pick me, pick me.
And actually, we walked away from that.
Buzzing, eh?
Yeah.
Do you get paid for this?
No, not a single thing. So I have been saving because I'm a solo mum. I need to make sure that I can financially support my babies.
Next step was an egg donor.
Hi, my name's Danae and I'm the egg donor.
Do you expect to play a part in this child's life?
Not terribly. It's not my child. It's Tim and Tamati's child. I expect that they will be 100% honest with the child about where it's come from.
Danae got busy producing eggs.
I can't remember the exact number, but I had something like 40-something eggs come out at once.
31 eggs.
But 14 that made it. We've got 14.
Yeah.
We've got 14 in the freezer.
7 eggs fertilised by Tamati and 7 by Tim. One of those was placed into Natasha, and it grew.
Come on, just go for it.
So that's interesting, Gary. I mean, he's in a same-sex relationship. I found it interesting because he uses an egg donor and then uses a different gestational surrogate. So there's 2 women involved, and that surrogate has 3 children through anonymous sperm donor. And we haven't actually touched on sperm donors, but that's another issue. And one of the men, not the politician, is the biological father. But there was an interesting statement in the story which goes back to what you said earlier, Gary, and it says, while she loved and nurtured the baby in the womb like any mother would, the surrogate mother felt that both herself and the baby knew they would be parting ways. She breastfed the baby for the first 48 hours, but unusually after this he would not feed again, and the family instead switched him to formula. And she said this, he just kind of weaned himself off me. It was like he was ready. We have become so close. It's such an intimate process. Now, that's a telling statement because it goes back to what you said earlier about the connection between the surrogate mother who's carrying this child for 9 months, and then suddenly it's over. The relationship is over. What was your impression of what you saw and heard in that story?
Yes, well, in fact, I thought, it reminded me when she was reflecting on this relationship between her and the baby. So many birth mothers grieve for their children after they've been handed over to their parents. And for years later, they're still wondering how those parents are doing. I think this thing about this sense that the baby stopped breastfeeding, because the baby somehow knew that they were going to be parting ways, that really felt to me like wishful thinking. It felt to me like projection of wishful thinking and adult motivations onto a baby's mind. I mean, there is something called a nursing strike where babies stop breastfeeding for a few days. And that can happen for any number of reasons. And sometimes it can happen because the baby, I'm not saying the baby did, I'm not going to assume anything about the baby's feelings in this case, because I don't know. But if the baby was feeling abandoned and feeling, where's mum? I'm supposed to be in mum's arms most of the time, and I'm not, I'm somewhere else.
Well, that was the other sad thing that I found about that story, was that the biological mother, the mother providing the egg, basically admitted that she would have nothing to do with the child. But I wonder if that was the view of the child, or will be the view of the child.
Well, exactly. And I found, I was watching that, and I was really struck by how detached the egg donor was. It is usual these days in surrogacy processes for with gay men for the egg donor to be a different person from the birth mother, because that's gestational surrogacy. The earlier forms of surrogacy that are less common now were traditional surrogacy, where the birth mother provided her own egg as well. Right. But of course, you have a complication there where the birth mother is also the biological mother of the child. And that could have all kind of side. If the parents want a sense that the birth mother can be bracketed after the child is born and can't have any claim to being this son's biological mother or daughter's biological mother, then that is the safest thing for them to do, so that the birth mother is then carrying a fetus that bears no genetic relationship to herself. And that's what happened in this case with Mr. Coffey and Mr. Smith, which was a case of altruistic surrogacy, where they clearly followed the regulations in New Zealand. It looked to me as though they did their best to treat the birth mother well and the egg donor, and those two men, they struck me as a couple of kind, thoughtful people. And what I will say is the baby's here now, and it belongs to facticity. It's a fait accompli. The baby's being here is a fait accompli. So what is important to me to say is that I wish the baby and the parents, Mr. Smith, Mr. Coffey, I wish them all well. I wish them a long and healthy and happy life. I hope everything goes well for them. But and I wonder whether people like that, obviously kind, decent, thoughtful, intelligent men who meant well, I wonder how much research they did into what can go wrong in surrogacy, what risks women undertake when they carry babies for others, what might happen to the baby, whether will the baby feel genealogical bewilderment, will the baby suffer psychological problems later on as a result of how they've been brought into the world. And also, they didn't do this quietly. It wasn't a case of, yes, we've had a baby via a surrogate, but we don't want to, it's a private matter, we don't want to discuss it. There's a 15-minute video. It's very public. And it's very public. And it feels to me, as a political activist, I can see political activism when it confronts me. And it felt like a political statement. And they were in the film was implying it's difficult for gay men to have their own biological children. And it felt like a promotional video for surrogacy.
Well,
and one of the things
in a lot of these social debates, it's not often the best argument that wins, it's the best story. And so this was a powerful story that led in and to the debate. So, I mean, that's why it was interesting for us to talk to you, Gary, because, we wanted to hear your opposition. I mean, I guess we're just about out of time, but I did want to ask you, what's your message to New Zealanders as we consider this proposed law to expand the ability for surrogacy and to normalise it even more?
Right. Well, I would appeal to New Zealanders to think very hard before liberalising surrogacy further, and I would encourage New Zealanders to look at removing the legality of altruistic surrogacy as well. And there's a great deal of information out there for people to inform themselves of the other side, because we read a lot of puff pieces, happy family puff pieces about couples who've had children via surrogacy. We read about things when they've gone well and everybody's happy, but we don't read about the tragedies. And I would really strongly encourage people to watch Jennifer Lyle's films on surrogacy and to visit the website of the Centre for Bioethics and Culture and read some of the material on there, and to inform themselves of the dangers and how this is a retrograde movement in Western society rather than a progressive movement, and one that instrumentalizes and commodifies women and children. I think we want less of those kinds of developments in our societies.
And Gary, I was quite surprised that a number of European countries have completely banned surrogacy, and they weren't the most conservative countries in Europe. I mean, on what basis have they just done a blanket ban?
Well, it's on the basis that it's regarded as a dehumanizing and commodifying, instrumentalizing form of treatment of women, using women as gestational carriers, as they're referred to in the literature. And there's an awareness of the harm that's done to women, and particularly that surrogacy draws people from the poorer socioeconomic groups. And the women who get involved in surrogacy in the main to pay off debts and pay bills. And of course, it's women from the poorer socioeconomic groups who are more vulnerable to health detriments. So they're more likely than other women to develop complications during the pregnancies.
So they've basically put the rights of vulnerable women above the rights of other people to have children through surrogacy. That's what they've done, to their great credit. But what I'm worried about is that the LGBT plus movement seems to have become an ersatz religion in our age. And people are not thinking rationally, and people are prioritizing claims and demands made by the LGBT plus movement over the rights of all other groups, women, children, even over the rights of gay and lesbian people. We've been redefined by that movement into bisexuals. I mean, the whole thing is an absolute disgrace and scandal. So what people need to do is resist this. People are not doing gay people any favors. They're not doing women favors. They're not doing children favors by promoting further liberalisation of surrogacy. Gary, really appreciate your time. We have Jennifer Lyle in New Zealand in a couple of weeks at our conference, so Excellent. We're really looking forward to that, and maybe we can get you over one time. But we really appreciate your insight, and thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Bob. It was a delight to speak with you.